He chose to stay, without knowing how long, without knowing the cost, and without any guarantee she would be okay. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet but powerful chapter, when staying becomes a choice, not a promise, and love is tested in silence. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. Morning arrived without any sound at all. No alarms, no hurried footsteps, no sense of urgency. Just a pale line of light slowly slipping through the narrow opening between the curtains, spreading across the hospital floor like something careful and hesitant, as if even daylight knew it wasn't allowed to be too loud here. Deep woke before anything else moved, before the door opened, before voices returned to the hallway, before the world remembered her again. The first thing she noticed was the rhythm, a soft, steady pulse coming from the machine beside her bed, even, patient, almost gentle. It reminded her to breathe, and she followed it instinctively, matching her own slow inhale to the sound. Her body felt heavy, not painful, just weighed down by exhaustion that sat deep beneath her skin, the kind that sleep didn't touch. She didn't try to move. Instead, she turned her eyes slightly, carefully, afraid that even a small motion might break something fragile that had only just begun to settle. James was still there. He sat in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his thighs, his head tilted to one side. His posture wasn't relaxed, even in sleep. His shoulders were tense, as if his body had never truly believed it was safe to rest. One of his hands lay on the edge of the mattress. His fingers were loosely wrapped around hers. Diep stared at that first. The way his thumb rested against her knuckles, the faint warmth of his palm, the fact that he hadn't let go, not even when sleep finally claimed him. She studied his face quietly. The lines around his eyes were deeper than usual, carved by a night without rest. His brows were drawn together, even now, as if something troubled him in his dreams. She wondered how long he had been awake before he finally drifted off, and what thoughts had kept him there in that chair instead of going home. Her chest tightened. The memory of the night before returned without warning. His voice, low, controlled, and yet trembling in a way she had never heard before. "I'm afraid of losing you in silence." The words echoed again in her mind, heavier now in the daylight, stripped of the protection that darkness sometimes offered. James shifted slightly in his sleep. For a brief moment, his fingers tightened around hers, as if reacting to something unseen, then relaxed again. He didn't wake. It was as though his body refused to leave, even when his mind wandered somewhere else. Deep swallowed. She felt a sudden urge to apologize. The door opened softly. A nurse stepped inside, followed by the doctor. Their movements were calm, practiced, the kind that carried no urgency but no reassurance either. The doctor glanced at the monitor, then at the chart in his hands. "Good morning," he said gently. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," Diep answered honestly. "That's normal," he replied with a nod. "Your vitals are stable. No alarming changes overnight." The word stable reached James instantly. He straightened in his chair, blinking as he woke, his hand tightening around Diep's without him realizing it. His eyes moved quickly, from her face, to the monitor, to the doctor. "So, she's okay?" he asked. "For now," the doctor said carefully, "but we'd like to continue monitoring for a few more days. Some conditions don't show themselves all at once." James nodded, but his eyes told a different story. He had learned long ago that for now wasn't comfort, and monitoring meant waiting, and waiting was never easy. After they left, silence returned to the room, heavier than before. Diep turned her head toward him. "You see? They said I'm okay." James leaned closer, studying her face in a way that made her feel exposed. "They said stable." She offered a faint smile. "That's close enough." He didn't argue. Instead, he lifted his hand and gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from her forehead. His touch was slow, careful, as if he were afraid of using too much pressure. "Does anything hurt?" he asked. "Not really, just tired." "You said that yesterday too." She let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Then maybe it's true." James nodded, though doubt lingered behind his eyes. They spent the next hour talking about things that didn't matter. The weather outside. The coffee James promised he would get later. A small memory from their last trip together. Something ordinary, something safe. They were both pretending, and both of them knew it. When James stepped out to take a phone call, the room changed. The quiet grew heavier. Diep's smile faded the moment the door closed behind him. She stared up at the ceiling, tracing faint cracks in the paint, following them as if they might lead somewhere else. Her gaze drifted to the empty bed across the room, then the one near the window. They hadn't always been empty. A tight feeling formed in her chest. Not pain, but fear creeping in slowly, carefully. What if this takes longer than they expect? What if I don't get better as quickly as I keep saying I will? What if... She stopped herself. When James returned, she was smiling again. He carried a small cup of warm water and a packet of plain crackers. "They didn't have soup yet," he said. "I'll check again later." "It's fine," she replied. "This is enough." He watched closely as she sipped, his gaze following every movement. "You don't have to finish it." "I know." They sat quietly. Then Diep spoke, her voice light, almost too light. "You don't need to stay here all the time." James looked at her. "I want to." "You stayed all night." "I know." She hesitated. "Your work can wait." She studied his face for a long moment. "Not everything can." James glanced at his phone, resting face down on the chair, then back at her. "Some things shouldn't." The words remained unfinished between them. By afternoon, Diep grew quieter. Not worse, but not better either. Her movements slowed. Her eyelids drooped. James noticed immediately. He adjusted her pillow, called the nurse without drawing attention to it, stayed close. The monitor flickered slightly. Nothing alarming, but enough to remind him how thin this calm really was. Night arrived softly. Lights dimmed, voices faded. The hallway outside felt distant. James didn't leave. He draped his jacket over himself and leaned against the bed, his hand returning to hers as if it belonged there. His phone vibrated once on the chair beside him. He ignored it. In the darkness, Diep opened her eyes. "You're still here," she whispered. "Yes." "You didn't go home." "No." She paused. "What if I have to stay longer?" James didn't answer right away. This silence felt different, heavier. He squeezed her hand gently. "We'll see." Diep nodded and closed her eyes again, but James stayed awake, listening, watching, waiting. And deep down he knew this wasn't the end. Night did not end when darkness faded. It lingered. It clung to the corners of the hospital room, to the shadows beneath the bed, to the quiet space between breaths. Even as the sky outside softened into a pale grey, the weight of the night remained, pressing gently but firmly against everything inside. James was still awake. He no longer felt the chair beneath him, no longer noticed the stiffness in his back or the dull ache in his legs. His body had adjusted to discomfort, the way it always did when something more important demanded his attention. Diep slept. Her breathing was shallow but steady, a fragile rhythm that James followed without thinking. Every rise of her chest brought relief. Every pause made his heart slow just a little. The monitor beside her bed glowed softly, its sound constant and calm. James listened to it the way one listens to waves at night, counting without meaning to, trusting it without ever fully relaxing. At some point, the sky outside shifted again, a hint of morning. James noticed only because the light reflected faintly on the floor, stretching toward the bed as if trying to reach her first. He wondered how many mornings would look like this, how many times he would sit here, suspended between hope and fear, waiting for the day to begin without knowing what it might bring. When Diep stirred, He felt it immediately. A small movement, a change in rhythm. He leaned forward. "Hey," he whispered. "You awake?" Her eyes fluttered open. "A little. How do you feel?" She searched for the answer, then settled on honesty. "The same." James nodded. Same was acceptable. Same meant she was still here, still breathing, still holding on. As the hospital came back to life around them, routine returned. Soft footsteps in the hallway, muted voices behind closed doors, a nurse checking vitals, offering a quiet smile. James stepped out briefly to wash his face. The cold water shocked him just enough to remind him he was still human, still capable of feeling exhaustion. He stared at his reflection in the mirror for a moment longer than necessary. He looked older than he remembered. When he returned, Diep was awake, staring out the window. Her expression was distant, her thoughts clearly somewhere else. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She hesitated. "Do you remember the first place we travelled together?" He smiled faintly. "You insisted on taking the long route. I said it would be more interesting. And you were wrong." She glanced at him. "You still followed me. I always do." Her smile faded slightly. Things felt simpler then. James sat beside her again. "They weren't. We just didn't know it yet." She turned toward him. "What if this doesn't end quickly?" The question wasn't sharp or dramatic. It was careful, measured, as if she were afraid that asking it too loudly might make it come true. James took a slow breath. "Then we take it one day at a time." "And if one day turns into many?" He looked at her, really looked at her. Pale, tired, trying so hard not to let fear show. "Then I stay," he said. She studied his face. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not," he replied, "but it's clear." Later that morning the doctor returned. More tests were mentioned, more waiting. No clear answers yet. James listened closely, nodding, asking questions. He absorbed every word, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase. Diep watched him, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened whenever uncertainty was mentioned. When they were alone again, she spoke softly. "You don't have to carry everything." He reached for her hand. "I'm not carrying. I'm choosing." By afternoon, fatigue returned like a tide. Diep slept more often, slipping in and out of rest. James stayed close, scrolling through messages he didn't respond to, glancing at missed calls he ignored. Each vibration of his phone felt heavier than the last. This wasn't just about staying by her side, it was about what staying meant. As evening approached, Diep woke suddenly, her breathing uneven. James was on his feet instantly. "Hey, I'm here." She squeezed his hand, grounding herself. "I felt dizzy." The nurse arrived quickly. Checks were done. Calm reassurances followed. Nothing critical. But James didn't relax. He sat back down slowly, his hand never leaving hers. "You scared me." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't apologize," he said quietly. "Just don't disappear." Her grip tightened. She didn't answer. Night fell again. Another one. The lights dimmed. The hallway grew quiet. James ordered food he barely touched. Diep managed a few bites before pushing the tray away. "I don't want you sleeping in that chair again," she said softly. He shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're not." "I will be." She watched him carefully. "You can't keep doing this." "Not tonight," she sighed. "James." He leaned closer. "I'm here. That's what matters right now." In the deep hours of the night when the hospital seemed to breathe with them, Diep spoke again. "Do you ever think about what happens after this?" He paused. "All the time. And I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to face it without you." She turned toward him. "What if I become a burden?" The words struck him harder than anything else that night. He looked at her sharply. "Don't say that. I need to know," she said gently. James took a slow breath. "You're not something I carry," he said. "You're someone I choose." Her eyes filled, She didn't cry. You make it sound simple. It's not, he replied, but it's certain. The monitor beside her bed continued its steady rhythm. Outside, the hallway lights dimmed again. James leaned back in the chair, exhaustion finally settling deep into his bones. But his mind remained alert, circling thoughts he didn't voice. How long could this last? What would it cost? How much could change? Deep reached for his hand once more before sleep took her again. "Don't leave," she murmured. "I won't," he answered without hesitation. As she drifted off, James stared at the ceiling, then at the door, then back at her face. This was no longer a pause, it was a threshold. And once crossed, nothing would ever return to the way it was before.
Chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.